of?
Well, my concern when I hear an arrangement such as the one that you've described, my concern at this point is that church becomes information depository. A person goes, watches a screen, gets information, and he goes home. I mean, that's not unlike my relationship with the evening news or some television that I watch.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no commitment to Brian Williams on NBC News. He's a fine anchor as anchors go, but once 6:30 comes and the TV's off, that's it. And my concern is to reduce church to that means that you lose so much of what the church is supposed to be and to do. If an individual is in sin and needs to be corrected and continues in that sin, how are they going to be reclaimed? By what means? If an individual is in need of comfort, is in need of counsel, is in a particularly stressful period of life, well, this is why Christ has appointed church government. This is why Christ has appointed fellow believers to come alongside and encourage them. So I have a number of concerns pastorally that if an individual is simply related to the church in terms of receiving information and nothing else, that we've really fallen far short of the biblical standard.
Guy, I asked you before the program about the historical manifestation of the discussion on church membership, and you had said that you had not found it really very prevalent until probably the 20th century. Could you talk a little bit about maybe why? Some of the reasons you told me why you didn't think that maybe you don't find the polemical works, you don't find it being such a pressing need as it's becoming more and more in our day to argue for the importance of church membership, local church membership.
Yeah, well, I think, as Protestants and as those who cherish our Protestant heritage, we look back to the Reformation. And the Reformation was in no way an emancipation of Christians and Christianity from the church. Luther and Calvin were not setting out to liberate Christians from the church. They were setting out to reform the church. And it's striking when you read Calvin's little tract, The Necessity of Reforming the Church. We often think incorrectly of the formal and material principles of the Reformation, Scripture alone, justification by faith alone. One thing that Calvin really presses home in that little treatise, which I commend to your hearers to pick up and to read. It's not long and it's very basic. He does touch on Scripture, he does touch on justification, but as much as anything else, he says, look, the Reformation is about worship and it's about the church, and the church being reformed according to Scripture. And then on, the question was never, shall I be part of a church or not part of a church, but rather, which is the true church? Precisely. Is it Rome or is it Protestants? And to which church ought I attach myself? Now, I think we find ourselves asking or hearing people ask different questions. And I think if you ask the question, for instance, why are evangelicals asking these questions, or people who are sympathetic to evangelical Christianity, I think one reason certainly has to be our very difficult experiences in what we now call the Protestant main line back in the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. And many evangelicals were frankly persecuted at the hands of denominational committees and denominational assemblies. Many evangelicals, as they began to see large denominations cultivating and cherishing, and in some cases embracing outright unbelief, they began to look outside the institutional church to one another, and they found opportunities for fellowship at Bible conferences and in common missionary endeavors and evangelistic endeavors and crusades. and that was all well and good given those circumstances. But I think one liability of that is that for some it meant, well, maybe the church as the church really isn't all that important. We can have this fellowship and this camaraderie, and we can work together. And I think for some that can help cultivate a sense that, well, maybe the church just isn't as important as some have made it out to be. And add to that the fact that in our society, Robert Putnam, in his book Bowling Alone, he's argued that in the last 40 years or so, there's been a noticeable decline in participation on the part of Americans in political and civic organizations. So I think we have to recognize that culturally Americans are joining fewer and fewer organizations, and he goes and gives some reasons for that. I think we also want to be aware of the fact that technology, as good as it is, I mean, it's what we're doing here. I've got loads of sermons on my iPod that I love to listen to when I'm exercising or relaxing. But we all have to remind ourselves, look, that's no substitute for the preached word. That's no substitute for fellowship. And so technology presents certain temptations that we look to technology to do what technology was never intended to do. And we look away from the church to do what Christ alone has equipped and called the church to be and to do. So I think these are some reasons why in our moment people are questioning the foundations of church membership. And I think it's all the more reason why we need to go back to the Scripture, and old and new, and remind ourselves now, why again is it that we commit ourselves to the church, and we're doing this not because it's expedient, but because this is a matter we understand of faithfulness to Christ as he's made his mind known in the Scripture.
Right. And, I wanted to pick up on something you said about the question during the Reformation being, which church should I join, and that difficult issue today. And I see two dangers. One is I see a society, as I talk to people who more and more are doctrinal reductionists, who say, it doesn't matter where you go to church, you're all, it's ecumenicalism to the core because of postmodernism. It doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're sincere, as long as you love the Lord. On the other side, and this is much smaller, would be like the Protestant Reformed denomination that thinks if, a somewhat solid, doctrinally solid denomination, but there, at least in some of the older ministers, the attitude of if you're not part of us, you're not in the true church. I don't know where they are today. What advice would you give to someone you met on the street? Obviously, you're going to point them to a Reformed church, I would expect, but where do we draw those guidelines? Where do you draw the boundary markers of what is essential to make a local church, a true church? I know that's the million-dollar question, but...
Oh, that's a great question. And, we go back to that old question, what are the marks of a true church? And, I think it's important to recognize, many of us are in Presbyterian and Reformed denominations, but we understand the Catholicity of the church, and by Catholicity we mean that we don't understand the church to be us and nobody else. We do recognize that the church is larger than we are, and we also recognize, of course, the church is more or less pure in different places. And that's not to relativize the importance of sound doctrine and good order. We need to work for those, but it is to recognize that there are bodies with whom we have some differences of doctrine, perhaps, of order, but we don't unchurch them as a result. But at the same time, there does come a point, as our confession says, when a church ceases to be a church and is a synagogue of Satan. So there is a line that is crossed. And the question is, where does that line get crossed? And certainly two areas confessionally that we look to are the Word and the sacraments.